Hello, and welcome to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to speed our state's transition to a clean energy economy. My name is Joe Olson. I do communications here at Fresh Energy, and I'm with you today to share a recording of our recent Get the Buzz webinar we hosted in partnership with Monarch Joint Venture, Connexus Energy, and MNL. The webinar dug into a recent study that shows solar habitat installations support pollinators and how the pollinator-friendly solar movement is growing across the US. And with that, I will begin the recording. Well, with that, I think I'm going to get us started. We have a lot to talk about today. So thank you for joining us for our Get the Buzz webinar, and happy soon to be World Bee Day on Friday for all who celebrate. My name is Joe Olson. I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Engagement at Fresh Energy, and I am so grateful to have so many people joining us today. And for those of you not familiar with Fresh Energy, we are a clean energy policy nonprofit in Minnesota that for 3 decades has helped Minnesota and the Midwest and everyone who lives here end dependence on fossil fuel, electrify their lives, and build a healthy, clean energy economy where all can thrive. And part of that work is pollinator-friendly solar, which is why we are here today. So as you can see, we have a lot to talk about. We'll be taking a deep dive into the recent study from Monarch Joint Venture, followed by a discussion about pollinator-friendly solar movement here in the US, and then a 101 on seed mixes and successful projects. And then we will wrap up with about 15 minutes or so dedicated to a live Q&A. So about that Q&A, a little bit of housekeeping. So even though the Q&A is at the end of the webinar, you can submit your questions at any time. We'll be using the Q&A function for those questions instead of the chat box. So please, you'll find a little button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Use that one, type your questions in there. And then the cool thing is if you like someone else's question, you can give it a thumbs up and it will upvote the question and send it to the top of the list. So this webinar is being recorded, and we will email you a link to the recording later this afternoon or early tomorrow. Now, on to the main event. Welcome to our presenters and speakers. I'm joined today by Laura Lukens, National Monitoring Coordinator at Monarch Joint Venture, Rob Davis, Communications Lead at Connexus Energy, and Jake Jansky, Director of Field Service Operation and a Senior Ecologist at Minnesota Native Landscapes. Welcome. All right, Laura, I think you have the controls and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you can take it away.
All righty, thanks, Joe. I will just see here. Try this. You'll have to let me know in one moment if this works.
Will do. All right, we see your screen. And
how is that?
Perfect. Yep,
great.
You're good to go. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Laura Lukens, and I work for the Monarch Joint Venture. And as Joe described, I'm here to talk briefly about a pilot study that we conducted on Minnesota solar farms this last year in the summer of 2021. So as I mentioned, I work for the Monarch Joint Venture, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We work to conserve monarchs and their migration across the United States. Since 2009, we've been bringing together partners from across the US, which includes federal and state agencies, other nonprofits, community groups, academic programs, and others that work with us to implement science-based conservation actions. We work in a joint venture model, which, as I just described, is comprised of many cooperative partnerships. And we've created a monarch conservation implementation plan, which identifies and prioritizes conservation actions. And each section of the plan are organized by the 4 pillars of our work. And that includes partnership, education and outreach, habitat conservation, and science. We have dedicated staff working in each of these program areas to serve our partners and advance the plan priorities. And we update this plan about annually from time to time with input from our partnership. So as you might have heard, the monarch population has been declining over the last decade or two. This slide here is representing the eastern monarch population. So monarchs that breed and reproduce east of the Rocky Mountains and those that overwinter in central Mexico. Western monarchs breed west of the Rocky Mountains and overwinter on the coast of California. The California or Western monarch population is a bit smaller, so we measure it a bit differently. And I'll discuss that on the next slide or so. But here, looking at the Eastern monarch population, we have the area occupied by monarchs in Mexico on the y-axis. So rather than counting each individual monarch, which is really impossible, there are millions and millions of them in Mexico, folks go out and measure the area that they occupied. And 1 hectare is about the size of a football field. And so you can see here that the average population size of monarchs in the early 90s to the early 2000s was about double of what it's been in the last decade or so. And scientists have estimated that this is roughly a 70% decline over compared to what the population was in the early 90s. This here pictured is the population of Western monarchs. So the green bars represent the total number of monarchs that are counted in the overwintering groves in California, while the blue line represents the number of sites that are monitored. So although the number of sites monitored has been increasing, the number of monarchs counted has been decreasing. You can see that in the 1990s, the population was well over 1 million monarchs. And in 2018 and 2019, there was quite a severe crash in the population. Fewer than 30,000 monarchs were reported. And then in 2020, there were fewer than 2,000. So that was really a really severe decline and a call to action. And then you can see that in 2021, there was quite a rebound in the population. More than 200,000 monarchs were reported. So that was that was hopeful, but it's important to point out that this is still a fraction of the monarchs that historically overwintered. So it's still quite a decline in the population when we look at numbers that were reported in the 90s and even in the 80s. Monarchs aren't alone in experiencing these threats. There are many other insect, pollinator, and wildlife species across the globe that are suffering severe declines as well. And these declines have been largely attributed to the loss, degradation, and fragmentation of habitat, among other threats like climate change and pesticide use. In order to bring our monarch population back to a sustainable level, maintain that migratory phenomenon, there have been some targets set to restore the population. In the West, that number is 500,000 butterflies overwintering in California. As a reminder, we had just over 200,000 this last year. And then in the East, the goal is to maintain 6 hectares of overwintering monarchs through time. And you might be wondering, well, how do we get there? What do we need to do? And so there have been some estimates on how we can do that. And in the West, the goal is to restore 50,000 new acres of habitat and to restore and protect 50% of the overwintering groves along the California coast. So many of these overwintering sites in California are not officially protected. They range in ownership, public and private. Some are on, in backyards on private land. Some might be in a park. They really range in their ownership type. And in the East, scientists have estimated that we need to add somewhere between 1.3 to 1.6 billion milkweed stems back to the landscape to recover the population. And to do this, we really need all hands on deck. A paper by Thogmartin et al. In 2017 outlined various strategies for recovering Eastern monarchs and putting these milkweed stems back on the landscape, and identified that really all sectors, all kinds of people need to contribute, or we're never going to reach our goal of revegetating our landscapes. And so that means, thinking about all of the different types of spaces we could add habitat, roadsides, urban areas, and so on. A recent study just last year conducted an analysis on our progress toward reaching national pollinator goals set by the US government. And they identified that many of these goals, or all three of the goals, have not yet been reached. So we're really failing to meet goals around honeybee, monarch butterfly, and pollinator health. And so one of those goals, which I just mentioned in terms of eastern monarchs, was the 6 hectares of overwintering butterflies in Mexico. We have not yet reached that threshold and maintained it. And then similarly, there was a goal to restore 7 million acres of pollinator habitat by 2015, and that's not yet been achieved. So that means we have a lot of work left to do. And when we're thinking about the expansion, the rapid expansion of solar across the US, that presents a unique opportunity to perhaps combine, couple pollinator habitat with renewable energy. And so our goal in this study was to understand whether pollinator-friendly solar can support plants and pollinators, and then to identify whether there are impacts of the solar canopies on plant and pollinator communities. So to do this, we monitored 4 photovoltaic sites in Minnesota 3 times each during the months of June, July, and August in 2021. These sites were located within an hour's drive of the Twin Cities in Anoka, Chisago, and Wright counties. They ranged in size from 18 to 68 acres, and they were all seeded with a native pollinator mix in 2017 or 2018. So it had been a few years since they had been seeded with that pollinator mix by the time I went out and surveyed. We ran a series of transects in 2 different light treatment types, one being the area directly adjacent to the solar arrays. So they were next to the solar arrays, but not being shaded by the panels. And we called those areas full sun. And then we also monitored areas within the solar array rows, those experiencing some shade from the panels throughout the day, and we called those partial shade areas. So full sun and partial shade areas. And then in each of those, we collected information about the milkweed and flowering plant communities, insect pollinators, as well as monarch eggs and caterpillars. This is just a picture of what one of those transects would look like. We kind of ran them diagonally across these solar array rows to capture the full swath of vegetation between them. I also wanted to point out that there were completed copies of the Minnesota's Habitat Friendly Solar Scorecard available for each of the sites we monitored. This is a scorecard that measures kind of the planned pollinator habitat and scores them on various things such as the seed mix design, the number of flowering species that are planned to be present in each different season, and so on. And all of the sites met and even exceeded the pollinator habitat standards set by Minnesota, receiving scores of exceptional pollinator habitat. So in terms of our survey protocols, starting with the plants first, we use protocols from a program that we run here at the Monarch Joint Venture called the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program. This is a national program designed to collect various information about both monarchs and vegetation. And this involved, running the series of transects that I just mentioned and placing 1 square meter quadrats along the transects spaced at various increments, and this allowed us to measure the richness and abundance or frequency of both milkweed and flowering plants. We also measured the presence and absence of immature monarchs, being the monarch eggs and caterpillars, as well as the per plant density, which just means the number of eggs and caterpillars per plant. And for this, we used integrated monarch monitoring program protocols again, and just involved examining milkweed plants that fell within a meter on each side of the transects that we were surveying. We used Argonne National Lab protocols to survey pollinators at the sites. And so this involved measuring pollinator abundance by order. So we did not do any collection of the specimens. We didn't do any identification to the species level just because of time and capacity in this pilot study. But we conducted 2 types of surveys for pollinators. One being transect surveys, where we walked the length of a transect and spent about 8 minutes conducting a really slow walk where we documented all of the pollinators that we observed flying within that space or landing on flowers in that space. And then we spent 5 minutes per transect watching a 1 meter radius and documenting any of the pollinators that landed on flowers within that radius. So in terms of the flowering plant community, we observed 72 different species in bloom throughout the season across the sites, 45 of which were native species. This was an average of 39 species per site across the season in bloom, 23 of which were native. And then on a single visit to a site, we observed an average of 23 blooming species, 13 of which were native. Now, when we wanted to look at, the difference in the plant communities in the full sun versus the partial shade areas, those outside of the solar panels and those within, we have floral richness on the left, which is just the number of flowering species present at a site, and the flowering frequency or the relative abundance on the right-hand side here. And so you can see that the floral richness, this graph on the left, was slightly higher in full sun areas, the full sun transect, compared to those in partial shade, but the difference was not statistically significant. Similarly, there was a higher frequency or relative abundance of flowering plants in the full sun transects compared to those in partial shade, but again, the difference was not statistically significant. When we look at these two metrics across the season in the individual months, June, July, and August, you can see that the number of species we observed was higher on the full sun transects in both June and July, but the number of flowering species was higher in partial shade transects compared to full sun in the later season in August. And then in terms of the abundance, there was a higher frequency of plants on the full sun transects in each month of June, July, and August. But again, these differences were not statistically significant. Some of the most common species we observed across the sites are listed here. Those are a mix of both native and non-native species, about half were native and half were not. So species like yarrow, horiolisum, daisy fleabane, birdsfoot trefoil, black fennec, sweet clover, prairie coneflower, black-eyed Susan, bladder campion, hoary vervain, and golden alexander were the most common that we observed. We observed milkweed at each of the 4 sites we monitored. Some of them even had more than one species, and those included common milkweed, butterfly milkweed, and swamp milkweed. There was a higher milkweed density on the full sun transects compared to partial shade, but that difference again was not statistically significant. But the mean density on the full sun transects was about 324 plants per acre compared with 162 plants per acre in partial shade. And again, you can see the distribution across those different months. Milkweed density was higher on full sun transects in each month of June, July, and August. We observed a total of 644 insect pollinators throughout the season on both the transect and focal surveys combined. And we observed an average of 45 pollinators during our transect sampling and an average of 9 during focal surveys on a single site visit. And looking at the distribution of the various groups, native bees made up the largest proportion of insect pollinators that we observed at 35%, followed by flies at 22%, butterflies and moths at 20%, wasps at 18%, and then honeybees at 5%. So even though we identified these to order, we did separate honeybees, the European honeybee, from native bees. Then when we compared these insect pollinators on full sun to partial shade transects, we did find that the number of pollinators on our transect surveys were slightly higher in full sun areas compared with partial shade, but that difference was not statistically significant. And there was really no difference in the mean on the focal surveys in each of these 2 treatment types. Looking at the distribution in each of the months again, on the left, we have the number of focal pollinators per visit, which were higher in in June, the number of focal pollinators were higher in partial shade compared with the full sun. And then full sun was slightly higher, or was higher in June. And then again, the pollinators were higher in partial shade in August. So kind of a mix of, there wasn't a clear trend in the focal pollinator abundance in each of these two treatment types. But looking at the transect pollinator abundance, that was higher in full sun on each of the visits in June, July, and August. But again, none of these differences were statistically significant. Looking at monarch reproduction now, we found that both the monarch abundance and the per plant density, the number of monarchs per plant, were significantly higher on partial shade transects compared with those in full sun. So 35 of the 38 monarchs that we observed were on milkweeds in partial shade areas, those within the solar array canopies, compared with the full sun areas outside. So just 3 were found on the full sun milkweeds outside of the solar array rows. And here you can see again that in each of the months, most of the monarchs were found in partial shade compared with full sun. We don't really know why this might be happening. This could be due to a variety of factors, such as the temperature of the milkweeds in partial shade compared with full sun. We know that we had very high temperatures in June. We had quite the heat wave in Minnesota in June. So perhaps there was a shading effect and cooling effect of the milkweeds in partial shade compared with those in full sun. But definitely more research would be needed to identify the various factors influencing this result. So to sort of summarize this, there were no statistical differences in the plant and pollinator communities within and outside of the solar arrays, except for the case of immature monarchs. Pollinators seem to use the habitat regardless of panel presence. We observed a high number of flowering species, including some invasives, and there were more monarchs on milkweed within solar arrays compared with those outside of them. I do want to point out the limitations of this study. We did have a small sample size. We monitored just 4 sites. We only conducted morning and early afternoon surveys. If we were to repeat this and have more capacity, we would do afternoon surveys to capture the variation in pollinator visitation throughout the day. And we found out sort of midway through the study that there were various seed mixes planted throughout these solar sites. So sometimes there was a different seed mix planted within the solar array canopies compared to outside of them. So we might incorporate that and alter our study design in the future with that in mind. But I would end with saying that these preliminary results indicate that Minnesota solar installations can indeed provide quality monarch breeding habitat, foraging resources for a variety of insect pollinators, and they can foster diverse communities of native plants. With many insect and pollinator species in decline, and the fact that we're failing to meet some of these pollinator conservation goals, it's really important that we continue to invest in conservation action wherever we can. I'll also emphasize the importance of long-term monitoring to understand the outcomes of pollinator-friendly practices through time, especially in terms of aspects that we didn't measure, like soil or water quality, and that management of the habitat will be key. We know that if a site isn't managed through time, habitat quality can degrade. And given that we saw a few non-native species, it's important that they be managed to prevent reductions in plant diversity through time. So with that, I'd like to thank our funders and collaborators. This was funded by Fresh Energy, and we thank our collaborators, Enel Green Power and NG Distributed Solar. And if anybody has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and my contact info is also listed here. So feel free to reach out to me with any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I think we're going to turn things over to Rob Davis now, the communications lead at Connexus Energy. And while he's getting his PowerPoint up, Laura, I want to compliment you on you're a scientist and a photographer. Those pictures are next level. So they were absolutely beautiful, and I think they really added to the presentation too.
Yeah, thanks. I had a lot of fun.
All right, Rob, we see your screen, and yeah, looks like you're ready to take it away.
Fantastic. It's great to be with you, Joe, team at Fresh Energy. Thanks so much for hosting such a great conversation right during, International Bee Day. And certainly here in Minnesota, we've got beautiful cumulo puffy clouds and blue sky in the air. So spring is in full swing here in the upper Midwest, or the Great North, as we are calling it now, I guess. Connexus Energy, we affectionately, I have been referring to us a little bit as possibly the most innovative electric utility you might never have heard of. And so I'm going to give you a little bit more information. We are a cooperative, so we're organized around cooperative business practices and the business model. We have an 8-person governing board. We're the third largest electric utility in the state of Minnesota, and we provide power to about 320,000 people, or roughly 141,000 meters across in 8 portions of 8 counties north of Minneapolis and St. Paul. These counties do include 2 of the fastest growing counties in this state, and so that means we've got a lot of homeowner interest in building new homes, as well as in EVs and in rooftop solar. And we have a really humble approach to keeping the lights on. We won a national award for grid reliability. So that is a huge focus, making sure that from all the power generation sources, wholesale and local, we are managing it all and really keeping power on, so that folks can really depend on it and take it for granted. But as you can see from this slide, we've had just growing interest from 2013 to 2016 to 2019, and then 2022 in members choosing to invest in rooftop solar, and we support their commitments. We know that there's going to be a lot more electric vehicles, a lot more demand from air conditioning on our system in the future, and so we welcome all investments. As a utility, we have also invested locally and developed 5 grid scale megawatt class solar projects. Laura had the opportunity to walk around one of them this summer, which was the Ramsey Solar Plus Storage project down at the lower end of the screen. But right here in our service territory, we have about 20 megawatts of grid scale solar and about 15 megawatts of utility managed battery storage, so that we can fill those batteries up when it's cheapest to and discharge them when wholesale power is at its costliest. And these really help us provide millions of dollars of savings to our members. That said, by having and developing local solar, we know we have an extraordinary opportunity to both create more local value as well as protect our brand and reputation. And so we know that some solar design status quo practices that have been used in other places, kind of create a lot of conflict. The idea of using productive ag land for solar is contentious, particularly in places like Minnesota and other states around the country, where you have folks pushing back on something people say is potentially an industrial use. So we're sensitive to that, and we know that by embracing our values as a co-op electric utility, we can stack more and more value. So it's really in our interest to ask for projects that help that connect with our members' values and help us provide clear and reliable, affordable and reliable electric service to our members. So this is our very first project on the right, and we were seeded this back in 2014. My predecessor here at the co-op, she worked with the team and one of our members, that's Prairie Restorations, up in beautiful Princeton, Minnesota, and they seeded this project that's just out the window here from where I'm at, and we're excited for it to be looking like this in the next couple of weeks as we get closer into the summer. We were delighted in doing some research to see that this project actually leverages a lot of the best practices that have been developed by Eden Renewables and Witchwood Biodiversity in the UK. So there's some tremendous leadership happening in the UK, and I think that we're just looking at what they're doing and saying, how can we adopt these principles, interpret them for our local context, and bring them to scale and and apply them. As Laura mentioned, monarchs are threatened, yes, but also all of the delicious foods that we eat, these apples and blueberries and some of the amazing fruits, are already suffering in their yields as a lack of insect pollinators. So if we want to continue to be able to afford apples and blueberries and not have to pay for human population or human farmers doing this pollination, or try to, I don't know, like have drones do it and use more electricity, we just need to keep the pollinators alive and find ways to make sure that we can hit those targets that Laura mentioned in just the last session. It is so important, as Laura mentioned, that we look at the entomologists, we look at the scientists, we look at the folks who have domain experience in pollinator protection, whether it's monarchs like Dr. Karen Oberhauser, or honeybees and native bees like Dr. Karen Marla Spivak, whose TED Talk I encourage you all to go watch. But these two fantastic women have been mentors to me in this process. So Paul Hawken, in this Ecology of Commerce book, I encourage you all to go read it. It's an oldie but goodie, but there is a phrase that says, surely we can design a system that nourishes and enriches the earth. And this is just, I think, a challenge to all of us, to the folks that are designing and building, to say, really, can't we do this? We can. We absolutely can. So this is not rocket science. It's significantly easier than that, and it is entirely possible to do. And it's exciting to see that there is actually teams of people working on this from coast to coast. The National Renewable Energy Lab's Inspire study, led by Jordan Macknick and Heidi Hartman, is just a fantastic resource of information. If you haven't read everything that's on the Inspire website and or watched every webinar that they've put on, I strongly encourage you to do that if you're really interested in this space. So the Inspire study looks at sites in a variety of different contexts and finds ways to stack additional functions for conservation or agriculture, and really to increase the uses and the benefits from this brand new land use in terms of which is PV solar. So the National Renewable Energy Lab and DOE, they know that there are going to be millions of additional acres. Some say roughly 9 million acres by 2050. And so we really want to be able to stack functions and benefits into these projects. And they're already seeing some exciting results. And so the pollinator habitat, when you establish it, as Laura mentioned, that they're seeing increased beneficial insects show up in a variety of different ways. And so this is an idea to make sure that we're still treating, what's behind me here as a power plant. It is a managed landscape, but there are ways where we can say, within that context of this managed landscape, how can we close out the stormwater permit and then create additional benefits within that context. So Nancy Fund, who's made a lot of money in investing in things like SpaceX and Tesla, she is a strong supporter of public policy. And so I think that is an exciting opportunity for us to think about when we put that in the context of PV solar and innovation. And so in that context, this is a scorecard that we as an electric utility use, because we're not pollinator experts, but we want the pollinator experts to look at our projects, to walk around our projects like Laura did, and to be like, yeah, okay, this is not like a reestablishment of some pre-colonial condition. This is a solar farm. It's generating clean energy. It's reliable. It's affordable, but it's also doing a variety of things that can help create benefits to pollinators. And so this scorecard that's been vetted by these scientists as well as state agencies is really valuable, and it's something that we use for all of our solar projects. And I'll talk more about that. So this is the first project that we did back in 2014, 2015. This is a photo I took in 2015 when I showed up back then. And then this on the larger project is the Ramsey Renewable Station from just a few years ago. And this is And then this is a little movie from Ramsey Renewable Station, just giving you a sense that, like, you know, this isn't Photoshop. This is just, you know, what an early successional bloom looks like when you get up earlier in the morning. And so there's the battery storage on the project. There's some of the research that's happening, the PV Smart study in partnership with the National Renewable Energy Lab and University of Minnesota that's modeling hydrology based on this, this research. And then here's some remarks from our CEO about this stacking of functions.
We're all trying to figure out how to green the grid, and there's a lot of different solutions. And today we're standing at one, and that is solar energy installed near consumers. But the special thing about this particular field is it incorporates prairie plantings, which gets twice the value from the land. We get the solar energy over the long term, and then the prairie plantings have a variety of other benefits.
So that was a video that we produced last year in partnership with Prairie Restorations. And then just earlier this spring, we had invited a local sheep grazer and the Land Institute to come and plant some additional vegetation on our headquarters solar project, just one acre kind of demonstration project at this point. But these deep-rooted plants are called perennial sunflower, and they'll be providing all kinds of powerful pollinator resources late in the season. And then the sheep are just, you know, an exciting practice that we're looking forward to continuing to ask questions about and seeing how we can incorporate more and more of that. These practices are also not just done by an electric cooperative called Connexus, but also some of the world's largest companies like Enel. They actually, from this project, here's Jake and Jordan Machnick from NREL. They're actually taking out advertisements in online places, you know, showing these land use practices and helping people understand how they approach solar. We also give credit to Minnesota Power and Dairyland Cooperative for projects that they have in Minnesota and as well as Wisconsin. And then here's MCE Clean Energy about their work on pollinator-friendly solar in California.
MCE launched electricity service in 2010 as California's first community choice program. Since then, we've grown from 8,000 customers in one county to serving over 480,000 customers across 4 Bay Area counties. As a not-for-profit public agency, we're focused on serving our communities with clean energy and programs that reduce greenhouse gas emissions while providing local benefits. One of the ways we do this is by providing clean energy to our customers through large and small-scale renewable energy projects. In 2020, MCE's publicly elected board decided to deepen our community impact by requiring pollinator-friendly ground cover for all of the solar energy projects being built for MCE customers. This means that the ground underneath or between rows of solar panels is simply planted with vegetation that attracts and provides habitat for pollinator species like bees, monarchs, butterflies, and birds. Every 3 years, these projects are checked to make sure they're still providing benefits on a pollinator scorecard. Policies like this are easy to implement, and they have a big impact on the ecosystems around us. The future is ours to protect, and MCE is grateful to be doing our part.
So something that's common that's between MCE and Connexus is we're both not-for-profit organizations that are working to provide clean and reliable electric power to our customers. But also I have to give a lot of credit. Xcel Energy earlier this year put out an RFP, last year maybe it was, put out an RFP for 450 megawatts of new solar projects. And they included in that request a stipulation that projects meet the Minnesota pollinator-friendly solar scorecard. And that's exactly what happens. You know, there's enough competition in the solar industry today that there are companies that know how to do this, and then there's those who don't. So it's never been easier as an electric buyer from a utility perspective or universities or corporations to actually just ask that you get increasingly green and clean electricity, but also that you include in there something about siting and design and management and the stewardship of the land under and around those panels. So in terms of cost, here's what we're finding. So PV Magazine reports that this is, not killing any projects. When you use a seed mix that provides an incremental pollinator value, that it can be done quite cost effectively. And then this report out of the North Carolina Clean Energy Tech Center, highlighted how the public is actually investing in these projects. So today's use of federal public dollars is at 26% up until the end of 2023, when it then declines down to 22%. So by simply asking for, more than just clean electrons, you're actually helping to maximize the public benefit. Connexus has seen no cost impact by asking for these design attributes. And obviously, based on a variety of different factors, whether it's context, the amount of rainfall, the soil types that are available, your experience and local experience can vary. But the key for us is that, what we're seeing is that our community celebrates these local solar projects. People find technology difficult to relate to, but they understand vegetation and they certainly understand flowers. And so a piece of research that was put out last year by researcher Alexis Pascaris showed that 81% of respondents in her survey were more likely to support solar if it combined production of energy and agriculture. And with that in mind, we're seeing, again, results more and more from scientists at the National Renewable Energy Lab and their educational and university partners. Cooler temps under panels, lower O&M costs, variety of different benefits are there when you choose to look at them and count for them. Obviously, as well, you see turf grass on the right, you see deep-rooted biodiverse plants turf grass on the left and biodiverse plants on the right. There's a lot of additional benefits as well. And I think Jake is going to talk about carbon sequestration as well that comes from some of these designs. There's the NREL PV Smart project. But then I want to also highlight that as a utility, that there's an awesome opportunity for engagement with members and customers. So we have honeybee hives outside a couple of our solar projects, and we provide that honey to local breweries as well as breweries in other places to use in their craft creations. We also have these delicious honey sunbeam sticks that are a hit with the kids and make technology significantly more affordable. And for the parents of those kids, we have what I think might be the first brewery utility collaboration, which is that we worked with this brewery called Invictus. They're right here in our service territory. And they put our service territory on their beer and then named the beer after the amount of solar energy available in our 960 square mile service territory. So this is really helping people understand that that there is an abundant amount of sunshine available, and whether people buy our renewable energy credits and become one of our members in our renewable energy club, or they choose to invest in rooftop solar, we support their decisions to do both of those things, and it can be really fun and exciting. And so thank you. We're excited as a utility to continue to ask for beneficial practices and learn from the scientists as well as the practitioners like Laura and Jake, and thanks Fresh Energy for hosting a great conversation.
Thank you, Rob. And unfortunately, so many of our guests are not in Minnesota. I don't know. I mean, they're going to have to make a special trip to get this beer, I think.
Right. They won't sell out yet. So book your tickets now.
All right. Well, I think we are ready to move on to Jake. And it looks like you are sharing your screen. Welcome, Jake Jansky. And your name brings out my Minnesota accent so much. I'm really trying to rein it in here. Jake works with Minnesota Native Landscapes, or MNL, and he's the director of field service operations and a senior ecologist, and I think struggling with a little bit of losing his voice today. So we won't be too hard on you, Jake.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Yeah, I managed to get through this incredibly long winter unscathed and caught a cold in May now that the sun is out. So lucky me. Also lucky you. That means I'll keep it short and sweet and allow as much time as I can for questions. That's a lot of information you've already gotten. I'm going to pile a little bit more on, and then we'll take it from there. So M&L is a ecological service provider and a native seed producer here in Minnesota. And we've been working very closely with the local solar industry since about 2016. To this point, we've restored roughly 5,000 acres of pollinator-friendly solar here in Minnesota. We, historically have been a company that does ecosystem restoration, prairies, wetlands, that sort of thing. And we've found that adapting those principles to the solar industry has had some challenges, but it also is a great opportunity to increase the amount of habitat on the landscape. So we've been very involved with the development of solar projects here in the state. Basically from the planning phase all the way through implementation and vegetation establishment. 3 of the sites in Laura's study were sites that we had seeded and have been managing actively, including with sheep grazing. So I think it's just a testament to how these 2 functions can be merged successfully. But what I'd like to talk just a little bit about today is kind of that seed mix design and just some of the processes and considerations that need to be dealt with in order to actually create a successful project. Because just saying I want pollinator habitat isn't enough to make it happen. There actually has to be a plan in place, and there has to be some long-term thinking that accompanies that. I think one of the most important things to just be crystal clear about right away is what are the actual site goals? How are those really defined? What are we trying to achieve with the vegetation on the site? Is the number 1 function habitat? Is it grazing? Is it some other function that is, new functions are being brought onto the market continually? So I think it's just really important to understand what the landowners, the clients are really looking for. Habitat and grazing aren't like mutually exclusive, but there is a big difference between using sheep to manage pollinator habitat versus using a solar facility to feed sheep and develop animal mass. So it's just really important to be clear on that and kind of look down the road at what your function is going to be. Within each site, there's a lot of challenges, soil types and hydrology being the primary ones, especially here in Minnesota. We have incredibly dry, well-drained soils. We have incredibly wet, heavy soils, everything in between and often on the same site. Some of these utility scale sites of 100 acres or more can provide a lot of challenges within a single unit. So it's really important to look at your soils closely and make sure you're creating a seed mix really specifically designed for the site you're actually dealing with. Tolerance for disturbance is a huge one because these are industrial power plants. These aren't like these beautiful prairies in the rolling hills and the middle of nowhere that are generally undisturbed by human interference. They take some abuse, and it's important that the species you choose can handle a higher level of disturbance than probably most of the, I guess, we're not necessarily just going for the prettiest flowers, the most functional, the deepest rooted, those that are able to withstand those conditions. Germination success, again, easy. You're looking for things that establish rapidly and are very easy to get to germinate out in the real world. But cost is obviously a big concern and factor for a lot of people. Native seed mixes actually go down at a much lower rate than your turf grasses. So when you're looking at a cost of a pound of seed, you got to consider that the rate it goes down is much lower. So the cost isn't necessarily prohibitive, but what can be is the market availability of certain species, These are perennial crops that we are harvesting seed from. They take years to be able to even produce a seed. So we're trying to project our seed production out as far as we can. But when these enormous utility scale projects come on the market, they just consume a massive amount of the available seed out there. And as supply and demand dictates, it makes it hard for some other projects who maybe haven't had the foresight to be thinking about their seed mix in advance, puts them in a tougher position to find the species they need. Might make it more expensive, or they just might not have the options available, and that would make their mix less diverse. So projecting out as far as you can and securing your seed even a year in advance, lock that down. So when the time comes to do your project, you've got the seed you need. And then there are definitely species you want to avoid. Height constraints is a big one on these solar facilities. We don't want species that are going to start shading panels or have exceptionally aggressive growth. There are other plant characteristics that electrical technicians probably don't want to deal with, thorns, rashes, these kind of things. So we try to take all that into account and develop mixes that are, functional for the purpose of these energy generating locations. All the planning in the world can't create a successful habitat without actual actions to manage it. You just need a very thoughtful long-term plan to get the seed established, to manage it. Like Laura alluded to, there are weeds. These are a lot of industrial or agricultural areas that have a lot of field weeds in the vicinity. Ongoing management is absolutely essential, and it needs to be part of the plan up front. We have integrated sheep grazing into that plan. We found it very successful in terms of managing habitat in replicating what a prescribed burn would do. Obviously, our clients aren't really excited, about the thought of having fire anywhere near these panels. But when we can go in and do some aggressive sheep grazing, really timed and targeted, we're able to replicate the positive aspects of a prescribed burn while also providing some fire risk mitigation and other benefits to the solar facility. So we have been implementing a grazing program since about 2017. We graze about 2,000 acres of these kind of sites in Minnesota at this point. We are currently studying the effects of the sheep grazing on the species diversity of the habitat. We want to make sure we're not doing anything detrimental to the diversity and the quality of the pollinator habitat. As Rob alluded to, we're also studying carbon sequestration on these same sites, both in the grazed and ungrazed areas. So, maybe next year we'll do one of these about those results when we have them. And now the pretty pictures. It works. This actually does work. These are all in Minnesota. Many of these are sites that Laura's studies were taken on. There is really good diversity, really good healthy plant communities, obviously a lot of good insects. And I think the market is just showing how successful habitat-friendly solar can be, how both cost-effective and good it is for the environment. And M&L is just really happy to be a part of it. So with that, I guess we'll turn it over for questions.
Thank you, Jake. And I think your sheep are extremely photogenic. I don't think I've seen a picture I don't love. All right, well, thank you. And it's wonderful to do this webinar with you three pros. And I see both Laura and Rob have been at work answering some questions via typing in the Q&A, just because I know we're running up a little close on time. So we're going to answer questions for the next 5 minutes, but then maybe anyone who can stay, we'll do a few more. We'll go a little after time. I'll cut our panelists loose. Guests, you can leave as well, but for those who can stick around, we'll dig into a few more. So let's start with the most upvoted question from Hunter. Hunter asks, who is in charge of paying for and installing the pollinator mixes? Is it the landowner, solar installer, state and federal grant, conservation groups? And I think it's kind of a yes and anyone, but Rob, do you want to take this one right off the bat?
Yeah, as a utility or any energy buyer, generally the way most solar companies are structured is that they are leasing the land from the landowner, or they're buying it outright. And so so it's usually, in nearly all cases, it's the solar developer who's building the project that is responsible for vegetation establishment. So there's generally, for just about every state, there's a stormwater permit that has to be pulled for these projects, and then that stormwater permit has to be closed out at the end of the construction period. So again, it's the company that's leasing the land that is responsible for the seed mixtures, the install, the management, et cetera, over time.
Thank you, Rob. And now I want to go to a question from Neil. Neil points out, because I shared in the chat the pollinator-friendly scorecard map by state, and Neil says that some of the states don't have scorecards, and I know we have a general scorecard that can be used. But Neil asks, which states are we actively working on developing scorecards for? And I think it's mostly state initiatives. But Rob, do you want to speak to that? And maybe Laura too, you might have some insight there.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of the, actually not, I don't think, all of the state scorecards were implemented with local support and local leadership. And so where states have a strong value for pollinators, that's where you've seen a lot of states lean forward and throw staff and resources at this. Fresh Energy has been a good resource for model scorecards that states can start from and provide a template based on past experience. If you have a scorecard and it produces results like what Jake showed and what Laura showed, then depending on if your state has roughly the same amount of rain, roughly the same kind of soils, then it might be easier or more difficult for you to implement something like that. So state initiatives. So Neil, if there's someone in your state that is a lead on pollinator conservation, that is an opportunity for you and your company to lean forward and say, hey, yeah, let's develop something appropriate for our region.
Thanks, Rob. I'm going to go to a pre-submitted question now from Lynn, and Lynn asks, I think, Jake, this will probably be geared toward you. Which native plant companies in the Midwest plant and maintain pollinator plants at solar farms?
Well, M&L, obviously.
No kidding.
I would say most ecological restoration companies who have been in the industry prior to pollinator-friendly solar have adapted to this market. So any of the local, native seed vendors, producers, or installers, regardless of where you are probably in this field now. I mean, we've seen a lot of transition to, adapting to the solar industry. So depending on where you are, most of your local ecological service providers are probably in this line of work at this point. And M&L.
Thanks. Okay, so this question comes from Terry, also pre-submitted. And I know we've been talking a lot about the industry and business focus here, but Terry takes a different angle. Terry says they're looking to help promote using solar fields for pollinator habitat. A bunch of solar is going to go in near their home, and they'd like to help make something good happen for pollinators. So this is like a community member. And obviously, I think, the first answer I think of is, well, you have a utility company that you could exert some pressure on, but there's also hyper local work that could be done too. And I know, Rob, you've been on both sides of that table. Any hot tips?
Yeah, I think it's really exciting to be able to go to a community and say, I strongly support this project. I think that just all of a sudden, it really changes the tone, that you're not there to block it or stop it or kill it. That you recognize that we need to do a lot more of this stuff in order to combat the worst effects of climate change. And so, that said, I think that there is a tremendous argument to be made about local benefits. And so leaning forward, working with local stakeholders to say, let's find a way to make more local benefits. Maybe there's a seed company in the state, or seed mixes available and published by some, people in the region. It is a really wonderful experience to walk through or even outside the fence of these projects, because the solar doesn't make any noise. When I took this picture, the hoverflies were so loud. That was the loudest sound I could hear, was just all of the hoverflies visiting these black-eyed Susans. Being engaged and talking about how the minuscule cost between turf grass and something better can actually provide significant community benefits.
Thank you, Rob. And Laura, you have been so good at answering a lot of questions via typing that I want to make sure that we hear from you too. So I wonder, was there a theme that you saw in some of the questions you answered? I saw some like before and after type questions. Is there anything you want to talk generally about here to folks who maybe haven't read through your answered questions?
Yeah, I guess I would also say, like, Rob and Jake, if you might have also input on some of the comments or the questions I answered. So feel free to chime in there with your perspectives too. But I think one theme that comes up, time after time is the need for more data and long-term monitoring. So we can't really answer certain questions if we don't have the data. So definitely, this was a pilot study. We observed great, our results were great. We saw, good things in terms of the pollinator and plant communities, but more data are always better. And so just to plug the importance of long-term monitoring and understanding trends through time and things that, understanding how management is effective or not. So yeah, long-term monitoring is kind of the one theme I would bring up, and trying to think of the other ones. I think the other, going back to the scorecard, some of the confusion has been around, well, the scorecard is actually, or the state scorecards that we were just talking about are kind of scoring the planned habitat versus the actual habitat that's on the ground now, which is more of what I was doing, of surveying what's there versus what was planned. And so I think there's a need perhaps for us, some kind of scoring to compare what's on the ground now to what was planned. And there was some question around that. And Rob might know, Rob or Jake, I think there are some, discussion around creating some kind of tool like that. But that was another maybe point of confusion in the chat or, discussion.
Yeah, in Minnesota, they have a planned, a pre-establishment scorecard and then a post. And I know that for these 4 projects, the 3 with Enel and then the 1 Connexus one, all of them had more than 2 or 3 years of growth. So there was, pre-scorecards, and then there were actually published, observed, established scorecards.
Oh, great. Okay. Thanks for that clarification, Rob. That's super helpful. Do you know if is that common among the other states as well, or is that just Minnesota? The sort of post-establishment?
It varies. It
okay.
varies.
Thank you. And I see a couple questions and comments specifically about water management. And I know we're not really talking about that here today, but I do want to put in a plug for the PV Smart program, which got mentioned a few times across the presentations. So we're going to send a post-event email with a link to the recording and a bunch of different resources. But I'll make sure to put in, like in the PS or something, a note about the PV Smart work. We've got some case studies, like the research is available. There will be like a webinar during Stormwater Awareness Week, which is in the fall. I didn't know that, but now I do. So we'll make sure everyone here knows when that's happening. But there are resources now. So I'm going to skip the water questions unless any of our panelists have any burning things about water right now. Okay.
Joe,
yeah.
I'd noticed one question about the mowing and kind of the impacts on the habitat, and I wanted to touch on that, if that's okay.
Please, yeah, thank you.
There's a question about how often is the mowing occurs, and is it done in a mosaic? Is everything mowed all at once? And I guess primarily our objective is energy production. That does have to remain number one on these sites. Once these vegetation or plant communities are established, we do what we call a height reduction event once a year. and that's either mowing or grazing. We do acknowledge there are times where we do things that are having a short-term negative impact on habitat availability. What we're trying to do is that disturbance event, we're trying to rotate it on a given site at different times of the year. So some years we'll mow a site in April, some in May, some in June, July, August, September, October, November. We can't mow them all at the same time. Like there's just capacity issues. It's also bad on the plant community development and evolution to do a disturbance at the exact same time every year. But what we do try to do is time it so if we do it mid-season, when there are things actively blooming, we might not mow it as low. If we graze it, we'll do it for a shorter duration of time, so the response time of the plants is shorter and they're able to come back. We've also developed strip mowing practices, which just mows like a 6-foot swath at the immediate low end of the panel, but leaves the next 6 feet of planting undisturbed because it's not shading, it's not doing anything bad. So we do try to adapt. We're trying to meet the needs of the energy producer and create the best habitat we can do within those confines. And I think it's important to remember that it is, none of this happens in these settings without the energy production. On a native prairie, we work on remnant landscapes, we do different things there. But we are very cognizant of that. And, we'll graze a site and it'll be blooming again 3 days after the sheep leave. And those monarch caterpillars are on the milkweed still. They haven't left, they haven't gone anywhere. They're just chewing on the stem, kind of waiting for something to happen. So, yeah, I guess that's just kind of the reality of this situation.
That's super helpful context. Thank you, Jake. So now let's talk a little bit about soil compaction. Oh, Rob, we're on the same page. I was looking at the soil compaction question too. I mean, I think that touches both on your work, well, all three of you. So Rob, why don't you kick us off? Sorry, let's backtrack to what the question was. Scott asks, soil compaction that occurs during construction is one of the primary obstacles to the successful establishment of native vegetation or any vegetation. Would the solar farm industry be able to implement practices to limit soil compaction, for example, low tire pressure, tracks, etc.? So Rob, take it first and we'll pass it around.
I think that the key is, will energy buyers ask for landscapes like this that drive solar developers to make choices like low pressure tires, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when the customer of the power then expresses a desire for conservation paired with clean energy production, then they happen to award projects to solar companies that have the level of sophistication to have those kinds of design approaches. So yes, they're feasible. They're not free. That said, there's a lot of competition in the market, and it is valuable that to ensure that soils don't get overly compacted. Jake, Laura, welcome your perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on. There are certain decompaction activities that can occur post-construction. It's expensive, it's hard to do, especially around a bunch of glass. It's doable. The native plants are good at decompacting soil over long periods of time, allowing water to infiltrate, freeze thaw cycles, at least in Minnesota here. Yeah, it's avoiding doing construction when the soils are wet. They're most susceptible compaction at that point. Obviously, no one wants to be doing that anyway. So that's a big thing, but it can be mitigated. But yeah, Rob's right. You got to ask for it. People need to know what they're getting into.
Thank you, Jake. Laura, did you have any thoughts there?
Definitely not an expert on soil compaction. So thanks, Robin, Jake, for taking that one.
Perfect. Well, I think with that, we're at 10 minutes over time. Yeah, Jake has managed to not have a coughing fit. So I don't want to push our luck there. So any parting thoughts from our panelists before we sign off for the afternoon?
I guess I would just like to thank everyone. There is more research going on, a lot of cool things we're trying to look at. hopefully we can bring some more results on, again, habitat quality, some of the carbon sequestration stuff, kind of watch this space because there's a lot of cool things going on. But thanks MJV, sorry. This is a great event, and looking forward to the next one.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We're just delighted to continue to work with great partners and provide more and more benefits for our members. So thank you all.
Yeah, and I'll tag on that and say, yeah, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today. Thanks for having us, Joe, and coordinating the webinar. And I think there's huge potential here, and it's exciting to see, how things will grow in the next few years.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Have a great afternoon, and do stay tuned to your inbox for a recording of this webinar. See you later. Thank you for tuning in to the audio recording of our webinar. You can stay up to date on Fresh Energy's work at fresh-energy.org or follow us on social media. And I hope you can join us for our third annual summer webinar series on Thursdays over lunchtime in July. We're calling this series Energy Plus, and each week we'll delve into how energy and climate is influencing democracy, health, higher education, and the arts. Learn more at fresh-energy.org/energy-plus. Thank you, everyone, for listening and subscribing to our podcast. You can support Fresh Energy's work by making a donation today. Visit that website, fresh-energy.org, and click Donate in the upper right corner. Thank you for listening.